Thank you so much, sir. So now we move on to the Q&A round.
The language of solidarity that has today become very pertinent and uh, very out there in theory. Uh, uh, so, so I'm thinking. So this is it will not be coherent. But when you talked about Ambedkar a bit and Du Bois and how Du Bois sort of shifted and pushed the color line to the problem of colonialism. Uh, Today in social theory there is an attempt, or there has been an attempt to create solidarities or conversations between the black experience and caste and the experience of Dalits in India. Suraj Yengre's book is a current example. What I'm trying to understand is that through your work and several works you have explained how theorization from non-European spaces can happen through lateral elaboration, wherein we take the empirical material from non-European spaces and theorize from there. So that is shifting away from the master location. How can this exercise of theorization involve an ambition within a theory to converse with other theories from other spaces, which is today being termed as solidarity? So what goes into making solidarities between social theory? Is it even possible, and what would you think about it?
I'll take them individually because I'll be brief, because otherwise, one question would get overshadowed by another. I think there are two things in your use of the term solidarity. Solidarity. I'm a great believer, which makes me very unpopular with a lot of people. I'm a great believer in a separation between something which is political and something which is intellectual. They are always related, but they're not the same. They can be related only if they're different. I cannot be related to myself. So, and sometimes, the political is also very hard. The political is hard not because it is always intellectually very hard to understand. It's not very hard to understand that the blacks are exploited and brutalized in the American society. What is hard is to be with the blacks beyond words. So I can, of course, be in Colombia, and let me give an example. This would make the answer slightly longer, but I think it would show you the kind of dilemma that you would face if you go to America as a student and as a scholar or a teacher. One day, very cold, I remember, about 10 years back, I was walking to my office along Broadway, a lot of snow, very cold, and I had almost reached the corner where I had to turn into my building. And suddenly, a young black man came out of the corner, and he was a beggar. But begging is very different in America. These things tend to differ from culture to culture. So he strode up to me, and he said, "Can you spare Can you spare $1? I haven't had breakfast." Right, and so I decided that I wanted to give him something. So these are embarrassing situations, So I was rummaging into my pocket, and instead of standing there, he said, "Sir, have you ever been homeless?" So I was completely thrown by that, and I said no, and I found a couple of dollars, gave it to him, and he said he took them and he said, "God bless, and I'll have my breakfast in that shop," which was just across the Broadway on the other side. So I came to my class, and I started thinking that I'm not an American citizen. I've been here for a long time, but I've stayed on a green card. And I live in Upper West Side, which is a good upper middle class area. I walk around without any sense of restriction, right? Of fearing that somebody would insult me or do anything nasty to me. And here is somebody, who has been in this, whose family has been in this country for generations, who has to live a kind of shrunken life, because of not just inequality, as I said, simply saying that blacks are unequal in American society is an understatement. So the point that I did not make in my lecture is an important point, is that Du Bois was actually showing the inadequacy of the language of inequality, which I mentioned. So, it's not very easy to deal with situations like this. What does solidarity mean? Right? I can make a statement that, I feel bad for him, right? But what does it mean for him? In fact, how does it change his situation? So, what I mean is that, in some cases, there are problems which are hard to understand intellectually. Like this point that the use of the term caste in Du Bois occasionally set me off thinking. And I think Du Bois went into something which is a really interesting intellectual point. But sometimes political points are not very hard to understand. They are very hard to act upon. So the demand on me to do something more, than simply giving him a couple of dollars when I met him accidentally, or saying this in a meeting in India, right? So that is very hard. I think that there is a connection between this kind of solidarity, political or social solidarity, and what shall I call it? I do not like calling it intellectual empathy, because I don't think I can put myself in in his situation, right? But that does not mean that I cannot understand that his situation is very bad. So I think it touches on complicated questions. I'm a great believer in specificity. And I do not believe specificity or particularity stops us from giving political solidarity or help or sympathy to other people. Right? But they're not the same. And I personally feel that, I'm put off by this attitude, which I find in not just Indian intellectuals, intellectuals from the third world who go to the West quite often, also among Indian students, that our responsibility is finished by simply giving speeches or saying something. The Buddha has a very interesting saying in the Dhammapada. Very simple, but very, very important if you keep one thing in mind. It says, Yatha hi ruchirang puffam, that's the pushpam. Yatha hi ruchirang pushpam, if you Sanskritize it. Bandabantam agandhakam. Bandabantam, just as a beautiful flower is full of color, but doesn't have any scent, agandhakam. Tatha subhashita bacha, like that, good words, great sentiments. Tatha subhashita bacha, afala hoti akupata. That is, it is fruitless if you do not act on this. Now, I personally feel this is a big question. I feel, I'll make two remarks about that. One is a factual remark. I think in modern intellectual culture, something has happened which induces us to confuse between saying and doing. So that saying becomes doing. So I give a blistering speech about something, right? Blistering speech about caste, or blistering speech about slavery, or black discrimination in America, right? It is still speech. It is not an act. I sometimes ask the question, why are we so induced to make this mistake? Because it's obvious mistake. I personally feel that, but you could say that this is because I'm a political theorist and I'm obsessed by this state. But I feel that what has happened is that compared to religious thought, which would not have done this before, and which would have demanded something from me morally, much more exactingly. I think the presence of the state and the power of the state to do something, to act for justice, I think has created the tendency among intellectuals to say that my responsibility is essentially to speak, to bring this to the notice of other people and to the notice of the state, but it is not my responsibility to do anything about it. So I think that the connection, you raised a question which is very important, the question of solidarity. But it depends on what solidarity means. I'm not a great believer in saying that, I would write this paper on Du Bois, and this is my solidarity with the blacks. Of course, in a meaningless sense, it is my solidarity with the blacks. But I don't think I should try to extract more out of this. It's a complicated question. It's a very important question.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for the lecture. My question is, culture such as eating with the hands, etc. That has now I've never been to USA nor I have interacted with immigrants there, but this is something I've heard, read, and seen around. If I am to assume that there is some truth in this, then my question is, what does assertion of identities in terms of color or religion in Western spaces does to the colorblind, in the sense that they may pose themselves against any aspiration to become white, but do they fall with the same violent intensity on the other side of the line as the blacks?
It's a very good question. Again, difficult to answer because of the variety of ways in which people respond to this problem. You might be thinking of Zoran Mamdani. Zoran, I don't know him well. I must have met him occasionally on the street because he was very young. But I know his father very well. He is my colleague in the department. But the question is not about his father. The question is about Zoran. I personally feel that Zoran is a very intelligent fellow. Precisely because, in my view, he has actually broken from some of the stereotyped responses of the left or stereotyped responses on the question of color and things. For instance, when somebody criticized him for eating with his hands, etc., if I were in his position, I would have given the same answer. I would have said that, the thing about eating with your hands is that we are always taught that when you eat, you wash your hands before you eat, right? Which is not always true when you eat with, with knife and fork. So I think but coming to your main question actually goes back to the question that I picked up from Du Bois. Because this is precisely what Du Bois was pointing out, that groups who come later, they try to get white-sided in their behavior. And they can get, because, American society is very complex. Because there's also another side of American society, which is either driven by moral principles, or strangely, for somebody like me, who is very critical of capitalism, driven by the pure principles of capitalism. Where some of them would say it doesn't matter who it is, if you know how to do something well, then you should be paid well, you should be appointed, etc. So that is the principle of capitalism, which can also go in that kind of direction. So I think you have an option when you are in a complex society like that, to try to try to improvise and innovate, what should be your response to that challenge, right? So some people have pointed out, for instance, about Mamdani, that he comes from a relatively privileged background, of course, because his father is a professor. Everything that I described about myself in New York also applies to Mahmood Mamdani, right? But at the same time, these situations, positions, options are not frozen. They get modified by history. And I think if you improvise, you can produce a reaction which is a very interesting reaction. At the same time, let me give you another example of something which I deplore, which is the opposite side. There can be people who, we have examples of people who have come from India, gone to Columbia, done a PhD, got a job in, let's say, a university, got a university position, and introduces, himself or herself as an American black. Now, if you ask somebody, suppose it's a woman who says that I'm an American black, right? If you say, why I'm an American black feminist, right? Now, I think the feminist part is the only part which is okay, because you can be a feminist. But why American? Because many of these people, when they move into the American society, because it is relatively easier to get both a legal and a social recognition in America, because that is also part of this society, because this society has a history of immigration. So the first thing that they would want to do would be to become an American citizen, right? Not wait even for a single day. So the day you become eligible, you apply for American citizenship. So they would say that I am an American, and going back to Du Bois, but using it slightly manipulatively, they would say that, well, I'm not white, and therefore I'm black, right? But remember that there's some black activists who would actually give a very sharp reply to this. Remember that the term woke was a term which was coined essentially by black commentators about people who said that they are as concerned about black emancipation as the black themselves are. Sometimes it can get into a kind of Leninist degradation, where you can say that we are intellectuals, we can understand something better than ordinary people, right? And so it is like that. And I think the important thing is I do not really know how to respond to this. I've occasionally been in exchanges, very friendly exchanges with, let's say, somebody like James Tully, who I consider to be one of the most remarkable figures in Western political theory, who wrote very interesting things about Locke initially, but gradually became involved in the question of the indigenous people in Canada. In some ways, he gave very serious help to them in their legal fights in the Canadian High Court. And so he is revered as a figure in Canada. He sometimes says to me, if I say that, well, an advantage with the liberal principles, if you use the term used by somebody like Sam Moyn, he would say that it's the nature of the liberal principles that those would be enunciated in a universalistic form, right? All men are equal, right? But in real society, the experience of people is truncated. But the Samuel Moyn kind of argument would be that because the principle is enunciated universally, People who are really discriminated against in society, they can use the declared principles of that society itself to fight against it. And it can embarrass the elites of that society to some extent and push them to give way, right? Rather than saying that my principles are different from your declared principles, right? If you do that, then there's a possibility that those people would say, well, I believe in my principles. If you do not believe in my principles, it's different. But you cannot do that with many liberal principles because those are universal but truncated. And I am persuaded by that. Jim Tully, who is a really, really important, formidable intellectual, he criticizes me for that. He says that you should not be satisfied so easily. He would say something echoing what I mentioned in my reply to him, that what is a moral principle if you do not act on it, right? It's not a moral principle. And so therefore, to say that historically there are principles which are universalistic but truncated, he would say is an escape. And we should not go in that direction. But I'm not very clear, if you do not go in that direction, what do you do, right? It's an important, question of principle there. But identities, I personally feel that, identities, I don't think, it's a strange thing to say, I don't think we have actually got a lot of good theoretical thinking about identity. If you look into the theory of identities really closely, which I sometimes do as part of some courses, I want to teach a course on identity, just the concept of identity at one point, essentially to take the students deeper into that question, simply to show how poor the conceptual analysis of identity is. Take something like intersectionality, right? Of course, intersectionality is an important point. But once somebody mentions that, it's also an obvious point. And you should not simply rest content by mentioning intersectionality, because intersectionality can go in many different directions. Let me give a very simple, obvious example. Take the question of women who are black and who are also, let us say, highly qualified professionals. If you go to American society, the number of women, distinguished women in law and education, just quite amazing. That doesn't mean that, blacks are not discriminated against or they are not a backward group economically. But at the same time, the number of women who are distinguished in these fields, not so much I find for some reason, which is the difference between India and the United States. In India, the field in which I find really distinguished women, not so much in law, but in medicine. You go to any hospital, you will find that the great doctors would be half women and half men. I found when I worked in JNU something very interesting. When I went to Oxford, I was totally shocked to see how backward Oxford was in some terms. Sometimes women teachers had different salaries. The number of women professors was just tiny in 1980, just tiny. It has changed enormously by now, but I'm talking about 1980. That's the first time I encountered British society as somebody who went and lived there. Compared to that, in JNU we had a much larger number of women teachers and professors in the faculty. So intersectionality works in many different ways. It sometimes works to ameliorate your conditions. Sometimes it actually works to make your condition worse. So simply using the term intersectionality continually, is not a sign of the argument moving forward. And also very, very many interesting new combinations. Something that I started thinking about through teaching this course on Marx, I accidentally happened to teach two courses in the same semester. One is this Marx course, and the other one is called Orientalism and Post-Colonial Theory. By which I do not mean the kind of post-colonial theory that you get in the English departments. I mean by that, thinking about philosophical questions which come out, of the Edward Said kind of critique. Because Said himself is not a philosopher. And Said is also not philosophically always very acute. So he skates over a problem, he sees that there is something there, but he doesn't pause. So if you take the argument about Orientalism seriously, there are many, many interesting philosophical issues that you can open up and start thinking. So the course is about that. So in that, last time I taught, I used a book which actually raises this question of identity in an interesting way. This is a book called In Defense of Barbarism. In Defense of Barbarism by a young French woman who is a journalist, I think, by profession, but an amazingly powerful writer, very powerful writer. Her name is Lisa Yousfi, Yousfi. She doesn't put an E. So Yousfi, Yousfi. And it's a very interesting but also a very troubling book. Because it is actually an example of what Aimé Césaire was talking about. It's by somebody who is a French woman. I think her family must have come from Algeria. She grew up in one of the slums of France. Very powerful writer. And her entire argument is that I do not want to become part of the French intellectual establishment. I want to remain a barbarian. Right? I had an amazing discussion with the students because I have a large number of students who either come from France or come from a French kind of background in Europe. Also because we have an exchange program between Sorbonne and Columbia. So people can do half their degree in Columbia and then go back. So we get a lot of very good French students. And increasingly, these French students are half white and half non-white. Black, but also in very large numbers, coming from Algerian, Tunisian, etc. background. But it raises a very interesting question that, if you say that I give up, I do not want to become part of the French intellectual culture, right? What would you be? I had a student in that class who I hope that he would become an important intellectual because he also writes exceedingly well, very well. He grappled with, I actually gave him that book and I said that I want you to do a critical response to this book. And I told him that look at the response of Lisa Yousfi to Frenchness, intellectual Frenchness, which means that you inherit the language, the older French, literary language, philosophical language, etc., etc. Bashir Dayan, the person I mentioned, he's from Senegal. He got a scholarship. He went to Paris. He studied with Althusser, and he did his PhD there. He is, of course, fluent in Arabic, and so he says that both in Islam and in European philosophy, we have a certain universalistic position that we can occupy, right? So I should use the knowledge that I can acquire from both these traditions, not just the European, and erase my Senegalese or African tradition. First of all, recognize that there's long Islamic tradition in Africa. That is one of the great intellectual traditions of Africa, right? Which sometimes some Africanists want to, they want to obviate that for political reasons. So he says, And therefore, I can draw upon both these traditions and be a self which is richer than either being a copy of the older French self or just an extension of the older Islamic self. And he believes that Iqbal, whether he does it successfully in every respect or not, it's quite clear that Iqbal wanted to do something like that because he was proudly Islamic on the one side, but he was also somebody who knew European philosophy, knew the philosophy of its time, people like Bergson and others very well. And he's not embarrassed about it, he's not defensive about it. So I told this young man that, that is one model. That is what you can be, because you have learned European philosophy very well. You can write very well, but in French. You don't know a word of good Arabic. You can carry on colloquial Arabic, but Arabic is not your thinking language. Your thinking language is French. Or you can take the Lisa Yousfi line and say that, of course, that is true. The difference between Lisa Yousfi and you is that you have been also trained in philosophy. She doesn't see herself as a philosopher, right? She sees herself as a writer. And so there is a kind of valorization of a rapper, French rapper, in that book, which is also very interesting, because the rapper is constantly provoking French culture, and every line actually says that I smear shit on French culture and things like that, right? That sort of thing. So he himself said, when he read the book, he said that, there is a part of the book which speaks to me very profoundly. But part of the book puts me in a very strange place. Because what do I do with the philosophy that I have learned, right? And what do I do with myself? So I told him that, that is the question that I want to ask you. You are 25 years old, you are 26 years old. You have the whole of your life in front of you. You are very good at thinking. You are very good at writing, but in French. And don't delude yourself. You have no way of going back to becoming an intellectual of your father and grandfather's generation in Algeria, right? That line is completely cut off for you, right? If you pretend that you can do it, you will have to go into a complete makeover of yourself. I'm not saying that you cannot do that, but it's very hard. So what do you do with it? And so this is the question, which most people who would come from other cultures into a powerful Western culture, which also has a very strong pressure towards internal assimilation, will face. And that is partly reflected in the Zoran Mamdani case. I've given you more of an intellectual-sided answer, but I think it's true of both, both the political side. And I think the intellectual side is harder.
Some more questions? Okay, go on.
Hello.
Yeah.
So good evening, sir. My name is Tirtham. Thank you for your lecture. My question is something that you already hinted during your lecture is, when we talk about Black Marxism, we already indicate some form of coexistence of identity and class.
What's the time now? I would like to finish by about 6, a little after 6, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
When we talk about Black Marxism, we're already indicating a coexistence of identity and class. Now my question is, as you correctly mentioned, that we have really very poor theorization about identity itself. Then my question is, how to understand the relation between identity and class in today's world?
It's an obviously important question. Let me begin by 2 distinctions, because I've done some thinking about it. It's partly a problem that I touch on in my teaching. I initially, on one side, I would mention something that I've already done in a paper But very briefly, the argument is not very central to the paper. But my friend who was editing that volume, he knew about that argument, and he said that although that argument is not really relevant, you should put it in because it should be printed so that people can discuss it. That argument is very simple. I take up an argument by really important intellectual, Amartya Sen. He has this book called Identity and Violence. And throughout the book, he says that I have many identities, right? So I have argued there that I do not think that that is actually a correct way of going about thinking regarding identity. Not because I do not have any serious difference with Sen, but I think the language is very important. What he means when he says that I have many identities is, he says that himself, that I can say that I'm a Bengali, I'm a man, I'm middle class, I also live in America, I have a political position. Amartya Sen would say that these are all my identities, right, in the plural. I would not say that these are my identities, because I think identity, the term identity, the grammatical meaning of the term identity should be respected. Identity means only one. And my identity as a person should actually refer to my uniqueness as a human individual, right? But obviously what he means by that, I use a slightly different language. I argue that those things, my being a Bengali, my being male, my being Indian, my being whatever, these are my identity attributes, identity characteristics. These are not my identities. My identity is actually the combination of all these attributes. Here I put in something which I think is partly an influence from Buddhist thinking. I would say that my identity is the contingent combination of all these features at this moment of time, at this particular moment of time. Because 2 years down the line, I might change my identity in some important way, right? So my identity is the combination, contingent, because it can change, combination of all these attributes or features at this point in time, right? So I have only one identity, it produces only one identity. And suppose tomorrow, if I become a great supporter of a different political party, right, my identity would change. And my definition of identity must be such that it has a place to capture that. But then, I also said something else which seems to me to be important for me. I said that, in identity, on the one side we have attributes, these are the attributes. And I also have an identity choosing function in me as a human individual, which means that out of these different things, my being a Bengali and a Hindu or a Muslim or, middle class, etc., how much importance do I place on them in my actual social behavior, right? So in that paper, I say that I can use two terms loosely, like adjectives and verbs. So these are adjectives, but I have a verb. So I can tell you that to me, the fact that I'm a Bengali is very important. Or following Sen, who says that there are some people, who he says it in a way with which I do not entirely agree. I think what he means is that there are people who absolutize one of these identities. And there can be somebody who says that I know that, I am all these things, but the most important thing for me is that I'm a Hindu, or I'm a Marxist, or I'm a Bengali. So it is an identity absolutization. But I must have a function, a verb-like thing inside me, right, to apply to this, and then say that, it's my religious identity, or my professional identity, or caste, or something, which is the most important. So this is the first distinction I would make. between identity attributes and identity function, which gives me something which is sufficiently supple and complex to understand how identity actually exists in the world, in individuals, and how it evolves. Another thing is that, identity is not, I think it's a mistake to say that my identity is who I think I am, sociologically. Because, I'll give you an example. When I was in London, I ask students sometimes that, if you have to describe me to your family, to somebody, how would you describe me? And some people would say that, I would say I have an Indian professor, right? Some said, I would say that we have a Marxist professor. Some said, but some said that we have a Hindu professor, which I found quite interesting. So I said that, why would you say that I'm a Hindu professor? So that person said that because you are a Hindu. So I said, what is the sense in which I am a Hindu? He was a Muslim. So he said, the sense in which I am a Muslim, you are a Hindu. So I said that, I'm not a worshipping person. In my own view, I'm not a religious person. And if I'm not a religious person, I cannot be either a Hindu or a Muslim. So he made two very important remarks. So he said that it's not who you think you are. He was quoting me because, we had done this discussion just before. So he said, for me, because I see the world that way, right? You are a Hindu. And I can give you a more serious example by saying that, the cultural context in which you grew up is essentially a Hindu context, right? So even if you are not a religious person, in that sense, I can say that you are a Hindu, right? Which I think has a major truth about that. And so he himself acknowledged that if there was a real social situation, where, suppose I fall into a riot, where people are being killed, right? So I might escape because I'm a Hindu, right? Because they're killing Muslims, and they would not kill me because I'm not a Muslim. So for them, I would be a Hindu. On the other side, I can also be killed because they're actually killing Hindus, and I would qualify as a Hindu through them. So I think this is the other side, of your identity. Your identity is not who you think you are. Your identity, one part of your identity, of course, is, right? But it is crossed on the other side, or matched on the other side, by the real social effect of somebody else believing, even falsely, that you are something which you are not. And from this elementary discussion, I haven't gone into something that is really complex, you can see how shallow the discussion about identity is. Because how many times have you come across arguments of this kind in your reading? I don't think you would have come across arguments like, you would have come across, the Tony's Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, that sort of thing. But, so I don't think the theory of identity is at all developed. There's a book by Francis Fukuyama, a short book called Identity. Fukuyama is a very intelligent person, right? But if you read his book, you will see how meager the resources of the theory of identity is, because he reflects what is there in the theory of identity. And even the distinction that I'm making with you here, which I have in a short paper, is not there. So class, there's one very obvious point. There's some identities which are dependent on your own volition, right? And some are not. So I cannot change the fact that I'm a Bengali, right? I cannot change the fact that I'm a male under ordinary circumstances. There can be more complex circumstances. There's some identities which are unchangeable, and there's some identities which are structurally changeable. Class is an identity like that. It is structurally changeable. It doesn't change very often, but in principle, it's a changeable identity, right? But my being a Bengali, or my being a Hindu or Muslim or something, is not changeable in quite that sense. It can change in the sense that somebody can convert. But we should also be careful about using possible things that can be done by singular intellectuals, singular individuals, for arguments about sociological groups. So identity is something which I think needs to be thought through. The only people who have thought about identity deeply, closely, but to my mind, also one-sidedly, because they were obsessed with that, and so therefore they produce a great elaboration of theory of that identity, but at the cost of any attention to others. Are the feminists, obviously. That is one of the great developments in modern theory. And the others are race theorists. But race and gender, it's understandable that these are very important in America, but these are not the only identities in the world. And intersectionality, the very concept of intersectionality, I think is an invitation to theoretical elaboration. But in America, unfortunately to my mind, occasionally the term intersectionality actually becomes an obstacle, because they would not allow you to push it beyond that, because they then feel that it's actually not doing honor to people who have thought about intersectionality.
One last question.
Sure.
One last question.
Hello. Hi, Professor Kaviraj. So, I was thinking about American blacks using the caste like in the Illuminations of Black Marxism, who has wrote this book upon.
Speak up a little bit, I can't hear you. Yeah.
Okay, is it loud enough? So, Wilkinson has written this in eponymous book. Caste.
Sure.
And then, so I'm thinking about even the phenotypical substrate missing in caste. We cannot see when the person stands before me. I do not know that okay, he is from that caste position. But then, so the Dalit writers using race to basically espouse their discrimination of the mode of race, and black makers using caste. So I think this is occurring. And as for the talk on identity, I was thinking about, are you also tapping into Robert Martin work on master status? That okay, you can have many identities, but because black can be doctor or anything, but because it's a black, and because that body is castigated and dehumanized, it's a black first. So are you tapping into that? Because Sudipta Kaviraj also talks about that. Okay, as you said, I'm a Bengali, so because there's a linguistic identity, I can be from a particular region. There's a regional identity. But there can be some master identity. Like, so if someone, like for example, Jinnah, so he may never be a practicing Muslim. He may never speak, Urdu, because he's more basically at ease in speaking English. But even then, when he's doing this project, he projects himself in that Islamist frame, where he's like Urdu speaking and all that. So I'm saying, sometimes, like for example, I come from Bihar, and sometimes people insult Biharis because we do not, for many reasons, because of the prejudice. I do feel, in the sense that I do not identify with Bihar. I never identified with Hindus. I ate the things that are forbidden to Hindus. But even when that insult is given to Bihar, I do feel that that linguistic identity of being a Bihari, as a person who speaks Bhojpuri, I do feel slighted at that point. Looking on Bihari this moment. When some racist incidents occur in Australia, and I see that some person is abusing my colleagues' slurs to the Indians, I do feel my Indian identity that okay, I'm also free. So just like you cannot escape, that okay, you're Hindu, I couldn't escape that I'm a Bihari or whatever it is. So it's many a times for the society which is out there to basically discriminate against us, or to frame us this outgroup, to solidify and calcify its inner group working. So, I'm thinking about, in this particular way, I would like to, do you agree to this, that okay, there is a masked identity, and so, like at this point, I'm also thinking that someone who's a Hindutva-wadi, maybe he's a Tamilian, but he is also for Hindi in Hindustan, because to his project, it always will. And so these two questions, and the third one is that do talk about the limitations of identity politics. The other two speakers, the first two of them, they talked about the one talked about solidarity, the other has talked about identity. From 2016 onwards, we are seeing this whole commotion in the US, like Robert Lee, his statues, the Confederate flags, they must come down. Whatever, like it's about the moment of reckoning. So where does it stops? Because you have written so much on decolonization, and right now we see in India that decolonization is being appropriated by this garden variety of disobedience, who want to basically project a Brahminical notion of India as pristine past, and want to basically say that okay, the Mughal history is basically by building Ram Mandir, by removing the history of the Mughals, we are basically reclaiming the indigenous in history. Is actually the government of the day is framing it as reclamation of the past, of the original past, as a project of decolonization. So do you think in identity politics has its limit? Sometimes it can open the Pandora's box and it can take us down the rabbit hole, which would make it more impoverished in many ways.
No, all these are important questions. I don't have time to go into elaborate answers, but let me mention a couple of things. Identity politics is, I think it is fatal if you do not take into account the existence of collective identities when you are doing politics. Sometimes I think I'm just now reading the book on Ambedkar by Anand Tiltunde. Very interesting book, and I think it's also a very important book. And you can look at the history of left politics in India as an example of what happens if you do not take into account something which is a very important part of the identity of ordinary people, right, into the kind of political articulation that you are aiming at. At the same time, I do not think identity politics of any kind can deliver good outcomes in the long run. Because identity politics, whenever you get into an identity politics, there's a tendency to absolutize the demands of one identity. Sometimes it is justified. For instance, if you look at the work of Gayatri Spivak, she says something which I think is true in the context in which she says that. She is thinking primarily of black politics in America. And she was aware of the fact that just doing identity politics would lead to unwelcome results beyond a point. But she says that in some cases, strategic essentialization is important for political struggle. So strategic is the important term, which means that strategic essentialization for her means that you can absolutize it in a particular context. And if the context of discrimination is based on race or class or religion, then I think it's important to pick it up. Because if you do not pick it up like that, then how do you deal with it? The ground on which discrimination is being made, you have to recognize that. Without that, you cannot bring it into the language of politics. At the same time, if you absolutize that generally, then of course you will, first of all, come up against internal limitations because you would not be able to go beyond that and create solidarities with others. Historical situations change, and the object of discrimination can be a different group after 20 years or 50 years. So I think the question of identity politics is to my mind, is not a matter of principle, but it's a matter of judgment. A matter of principle is something which is right under all circumstances. A matter of judgment is something which is right under a contextual judgment. If there's a particular kind of context, of course you have to do that. But if you go beyond that, then you will hit difficulties which are sometimes very, very difficult to resolve. For instance, the example that I gave you of the French student and his dilemma between somebody who makes his Frenchness, it divides a new kind of Frenchness, where his background coming from Algeria becomes a positive point. It brings something into Frenchness which Frenchness did not have before, right? So that is one possibility. On the other side, he's saying that I come from that background and I would never, take part in your Frenchness because it has always excluded me. Creates problems, which is the example that I gave you from the work of this woman, which is very powerful, extremely passionate, makes a point which in that context is undeniably true, but at the same time, if you push that into becoming a principle, it actually pushes you essentially into a quandary. So identity politics, I personally feel that there are two things about identity politics. One is that our intellectual resources about thinking about identity itself is poor. Social theorists, whose responsibility it is to think about how identity works, what is identity, what are the circumstances in which identity becomes mobilized, we haven't done good, serious conceptual work on that. There's a lot of historical work, there's a lot of work on mobilization, there's a lot of work on sociological work on discrimination and things like that. But those are different. I think the conceptual work on identity and identity in society and history, I think is not highly developed. That is one problem. The problem of politics is a different kind of problem. That on the one side, I think it's foolish to neglect it if it is linked to a question of justice and injustice. On the other side, even if it is linked to the question of justice and injustice, to absolutize that after some time would put you into some kind of political difficulty. So I think it's a difficult question, and I personally feel that this is something which worries me as an Indian living in the United States, that the power of the American academia, the soft power of the American academia, the exemplary power as an example of American academia, I think sometimes has a negative effect in the sense that the identity problems in America are not the identity problems elsewhere in the world. So caste and race, I think, is a good example because both are very important. There are some similarities, but they're not the same. And so therefore what we need to do is to produce a sociology which is a particularistic sociology. A sociology which doesn't actually jump to a conclusion simply because it happens in America about race and vice versa, right? But at the same time, I do not believe that if you take the particular seriously, I'm a historicist in my methodological thinking, but it doesn't seem to me that if you're a historicist, you lose the ability to do intelligent and useful comparisons and connections, between different things. But if you do something which is too much of a comparative exercise, which disregards particularities, which I find very often in American social science work, that I don't think leads to serious historical understanding.
A very warm and grateful good evening to everyone present. On behalf of JNU lecture series team and the entire student community present here, I extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Sudipta Kaviraj for gracing us with his truly enlightening lecture on Illuminations of Black Marxism. While not reducing it to exams alone, sir, for many of us, I am sure that Sudipta Kaviraj professor's work has been a source for widening our understanding on political theory, and we have been carrying this work to exam halls too. While we can talk about the coloniality of the exam system that goes on today, but surely most of us do quote Kaviraj once or more than once in our exams. So it was an enlightening experience to listen to you today in person, and apart from that, in a wider spectrum for people here, including me, who have been grappling with these questions of identity, who am I, the questions of self, within this context of a post-colonial society. I think your emphasis on the gaps in the society, the questions of intersectionality and the role of language invite discussion, and I'm sure that in our thinking circles and in our discussion circles in JNU, we'll be carrying forward the discussion on these topics, and the discussion that has been sparked today will be carried forward in future too. So thank you so much, sir, for enlightening us today. I would like to extend our gratitude to the organizers, faculty members and volunteers, and everyone who worked behind the scenes to make this a success.